Welcome everyone. I see a bunch of people connecting to audio, so I'll give a few moments so we can all join. Welcome. Great, a few more here to admit. Great. Well, thank you to everyone for joining Ask the Alliance. Last summer, the Alliance hosted its first live talk webinar series, which we had called Breakfast on the Bay. We united staff expertise and our partnerships experience to explore the impact we have on the Chesapeake Bay health. And as our staff continues to grow at the Alliance, our expertise does too. So this year, the Alliance staff will share their knowledge on things that you can do at home to both enjoy and improve the health of the Chesapeake Bay watershed. And today you'll have the opportunity to ask the Alliance. With the hope for these sessions to be interactive, please feel free to join with your camera on, but please remain on mute. You will have the opportunity to ask questions with the last 10 minutes or so of our session. You can also submit any questions or anything you'd like clarified via the chat box, and I'll make sure they get those over to Zach as well. So with that, I'm excited to welcome and introduce Zach Carnegie, our Maryland Forest Projects Coordinator, to learn more about how we can plant, prune, and maintain our trees at home. So with that, Zach, I'll hand it over to you.
Thanks, Lauren. I'm going to go ahead and share my screen here. Right. Let me know when that's loaded up.
Looks good.
Awesome. All right. Good afternoon, everybody. Thank you for joining us. And thank you, Lauren, for that introduction. As she mentioned, my name is Zach Carnegie. I'm going to be talking today about tree planting and maintenance, in your backyard. So first, I kind of want to start with mentioning a couple resources that are available online for folks. If you would like to, have some more in-depth information or something that you can refer back to, these are available as PDFs online provided from the U.S. Forest Service, especially this one here on the right. It's called the Tree Owner's Manual, and that's exactly what it is. From planting to maintaining, pruning, everything is kind of in that little document. And you might be able to even order excuse me, a few copies of this online. So this Urban Watershed Forestry Manual document is a little bit more in depth. It's a little bit more of a dense read, but also a great resource. Has all the information we're going to talk about today and more. So I also want to start by mentioning, if you're looking to do some plantings on your property, definitely recommend checking out our website we put together with the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service. It's called the Chesapeake Bay Native Plant Center. So you can either come in here and search for species, you'll get information on those species, or you select your region, the plant type you're looking for, tree or shrub, what the sun exposure is for that site, soil texture, and a whole bunch more filters. And then it'll produce a list of native trees and shrubs that you could select from based off that criteria. So really good resource. And as always, we want to encourage plant native species only if you can. So I'm going to start kind of from the beginning, right? When you're first looking at planting a tree on your property, you're going to have to go purchase it somewhere, right? So when you go to the nursery, if you have the opportunity to go to the nursery, you're not having it delivered. We always recommend that you inspect that stock, while you're there. Just to kind of touch on a couple of these items, you want to make sure that there's ample crown, to the ratio of the height of that tree. At least 60%, but I'd say if it's at least 50% of the height, from where you can see the top of the container to the top of the tree, if at least 50 or 60% of that for deciduous trees is lateral branches with buds or leaves, depending on the time of year you're buying this, that's what you want to look for. What you don't want is what we call a lion's tail, where you've got mostly a stem and then just a little bit of lateral branching and canopy at the top. because what you're looking at here is, the leaves are the food factory of the tree. You want to have ample amount of leaves that are going to produce enough food to sustain the wood and growth of that tree. You also want to make sure you're checking for any damage, whether it's damaged limbs, damage to the main stem, and also one central leader, which we're going to talk a little bit more in depth about these as we go on. The damage is really easy to miss sometimes, but it's always important to take a look at. So kind of a zoomed in picture here on the left, we had a tree. Clearly it was damaged at some point in time. A lot of these containerized trees especially are grown in small containers, and they're moved to larger and larger ones as the seasons go on, as they get bigger. So sometime during that transition, it was damaged. It's starting, maybe it could grow over that wound. Might not be a problem, but it's also sending up some shoots indicating that tree is under stress. So if this is a species you really wanted and there's none other ones there, it might be worth still purchasing. But if you had other options of the same species that you're looking for, definitely avoid this one. Same thing here on the right. You've got 3 of the same species. I'd avoid the one that's got that kind of sharp bend there at the base of the trunk. Go for one that's a little bit straighter. Now, this is easier said than done. Sometimes it's slim pickings when you're at the nursery, and other times you're getting it delivered. You don't really have much of a choice. But if you can start with the healthiest stock possible, you're ensuring the longevity of that tree. All right, so what time do you want to plant your trees? Well, you've already done your inspection, you've got your stock, or you're looking to purchase the stock. We recommend planting in the spring or fall seasons. In the spring, you're basically looking at late March through April here in Maryland, depending on where you are within the Chesapeake Bay watershed, or maybe some of you are from outside of the Chesapeake Bay watershed. The kind of rule of thumb is you're aiming in the spring to plant after the last frost, right? The ground has thawed for the season, but you're planting before that hot, dry weather sets in. In the fall, you're going to be planting kind of the opposite, right? You're waiting until that hot and dry weather subsides, and then you're going to plant up until you get close to the ground freezing over. This might vary depending on the type of tree stock you're buying. If it's, bare root seedlings, which you can buy for very cheap, they're really tiny. They look kind of like little twigs. They barely have a root system established. Those are only cut and sold, in late winter for early spring plantings, where you're still in a dormant season. So if you're buying bare root seedlings, then you're only going to be able to really plant in the spring. All this being said, it doesn't mean you can't plant a tree, in summertime. Obviously, you're not going to be planting trees in the winter when the ground's frozen. But if for some reason you need to plant in the summer, you're just going to have to pay more attention to watering that tree as it's initially trying to establish, again, because hotter, drier conditions. All right, so once you get your stock and you're looking to plant it, what you need to do first is identify where the root collar is. And that's what this arrow is pointing to right here. You can kind of see there's a flare out of this main stem. And this one's actually pretty clear where you can almost see a line. This is where the bark kind of transitions from above ground, the main stem, down into the root system. So when you're looking for the root collar, because that's about the level you want to plant this tree to in the ground. If you bury that root collar, that means you've got soil that's up against the bark here that's meant to be above ground. That bark's going to decay, and it becomes an opportunity for rot to enter into the tree. It's not meant to stay in contact with moisture, whereas the bark of the roots is adapted to that. So sometimes, as we'll see in the next picture, you might have to do some digging to get to this root collar. And again, depending on the size tree you buy, maybe it's a ball and burlap tree. Those are typically much larger trees people plant in urban settings because you kind of get that instant, tree effect. You might have to remove a lot of that material and do some digging. In this next slide, you'll see this is probably what, a 10-gallon, maybe 15 containerized tree that we had to dig down, 2 to 3 inches to find that root collar. Because again, as these are grown in the nursery and transplanted from a small pot to a bigger and bigger and bigger, they'll add more of this material in here, and sometimes they completely bury that root collar. So just make sure, especially if you're buying the stock and you have to wait a while to plant it, you might as well go ahead and find that root collar and allow that bark to dry out. So especially if you're buying containerized seedlings, something you might run into is the trees being root bound, especially in those larger containers. I find typically 15, especially 25-gallon trees. They've been growing in these containers for a long time. The trees are typically fairly big, meaning their root systems are pretty big. And we end up with what you see here on the right. So those roots grow out laterally till they hit the container, and then they continue to spiral around and around and get larger in diameter. So we need to break this up before we put this tree in the ground, because otherwise, as those roots continue to circle and grow larger in diameter, they're actually going to end up crushing the xylem and phloem layers just under the bark where water nutrients are transported through, effectively physically girdling those roots and potentially leading to the death of that tree. When we do volunteer plantings, I find this is something a lot of folks are kind of uneasy about at first, but feel free to get in there and be pretty rough with them. If they're small, use your hands. If they're large, like this image, you'll need some hand pruners, maybe a soil knife. That's what we like to use. But even if you just have a pocket knife on you, really get in there and break those up. And it's actually going to stimulate new root growth coming from those. So it's good for the tree. And this is what we want to avoid. So this looks like a maple that's pretty well established, decades old, but look at this encircling root, that's also growing up out of the soil. So that's an issue. But also, as you can see, the outer layer of the tree is starting to grow over that root, which means one of the two of these is probably experiencing, again, that xylem and that phloem, those layers of the tree being crushed. And even if this tree grows completely around this root, which we've all probably seen fences, old farm fences be grown around, or gates at abandoned parks, things like that, that becomes a weak point for this tree. It's also potentially trapping moisture in there, which could lead to the growth of bacteria or fungus. So this right now, this tree is pretty well established, but as this continues, could eventually shorten the lifespan of this tree. This is kind of the process that, from start to finish of what you want it to look like. You can tell this tree was grown in a container, that root ball is holding that shape. Get in there with a pocket knife or your hands, especially if the roots are this fine. Really get in there and break it up so that at the end, this is kind of what you're left with. The roots are still, the root ball is intact, but it doesn't look like the shape of that container anymore. You can kind of loosen those roots up, pull them outward before you put it in the ground. Then you need to determine the depth of the hole for the tree that you're planting. Now, this is going to vary, obviously, by the size of the tree, the size of the root ball. And I find it's helpful to do this after you break up that root ball, because it might end up shortening, becoming a little bit more narrow. Now, I'll be honest, I don't go out here with a tape measure or a ruler and measure the root mass and then measure on the ground. I just kind of picked up, the more you plant these, the more experience you're going to get at kind of eyeballing and starting. But I recommend either starting by measuring the height from the root collar down to the base of that root mass. Same thing with the width, right? What's the width of your root mass? But you could also, kind of just eyeball it. And then I always recommend, dig smaller than you think you need, then take your tree, do a test fit, and you can move the tree back, dig a little bit deeper, dig a little bit wider. That way you're not having to backfill a lot of soil before you put that tree in, because again, we do not want to bury that root collar. We also don't want to leave loose soil in the bottom of that hole, because during the next heavy rainstorm or a freeze and thaw cycle, if the bottom of that hole is got loose soil, it's not fairly compacted, it could cause that tree to sink or shift, and then we're causing other issues. We do recommend digging the hole 2 to 3 times wider than the existing root ball of that tree, especially if you're planting in an urban environment where the soils might be compacted. This is kind of a double-edged sword. So we're making the hole wider so that it's easier for those roots to grow out laterally. It's almost aerating the soil as well. We're allowing macro and micropores to be established. Again, really important in compacted soils. But if we're using, some sort of a deer protection where we're driving stakes in the ground to hold that deer protection up, you've got to think about those stakes, if they're not in undisturbed soil, are bound to fall or lean. And then you got to come back and fix that. So however wide you make your hole, just keep in mind the type of protection materials you're going to use, and allow for undisturbed soil to be close enough to that tree that you can get your stakes in, and then your deer protection around it, which we're going to talk a little bit about later. And then backfill your hole with the same soil. So you've got it to the right depth. You've got your tree set in there, centered in the hole. We're going to take the soil that we dug out. Sometimes it's handy to have a tarp present. You might be able to use the container that the tree came out of. I find this is really helpful because then you're not picking soil out of the grass. Sometimes, somehow there's barely just enough soil to put back in there once you put the tree in. So if you've got it on a tarp or in a bucket or something like that, you can really maximize the amount of soil you reuse. Before you backfill that hole, make sure you break up the clumps into as fine of particles as you can get it. Now, this is easier said than done. So I live up in Carroll County, and we've got pretty clay heavy soil. So especially if it's damp, it's a lot easier said than done to kind of break it up into small particles. But the smaller you can get it, the better. Again, it allows for kind of a better backfill where you can, I don't want to say compact it, right? Because we're not going to compact the soil around the tree, but we want to pack it in there well enough that it's not going to shift during the next rainstorm or freeze and thaw cycle. And those smaller particles create better space within them to trap air, which is important for the roots, as well as moisture. One of the ways you can do this is adding a little bit of water as you backfill that hole if you have access to it. That's not always the case in a lot of settings where we plant trees, and you're kind of simultaneously giving that tree its first watering since it's been planted. The other method you can use is just, again, using kind of your fingertips, your knuckles, just lightly, pack that soil in around the tree as you fill the hole up, making sure you're not leaving too big of air pockets because those can dry the roots out and lead them to die. And last but not least, making sure you're not burying that root collar. So once you've got your tree planted, your hole's been backfilled, and you provided a little bit of water, we recommend using some mulch. This kind of provides a myriad of benefits. First of all, it helps, retain moisture within the soil, especially over that critical root zone of that newly planted tree. It also helps prevent competition from weeds or turf grass. I think we had a question, even surrounding this about mulching around trees with poison ivy or other things growing around the base. And I always recommend, if you have, the means to do it, do it. An established tree, isn't going to have as much of an issue getting moisture and nutrients as it's got a larger root system. But these freshly planted trees, it's really important to do that, to reduce that competition. One of the other great benefits, especially if you're planting in a park or a public setting, or you yourself might not be comfortable mowing around your trees, you can create that kind of physical barrier that you don't have to feel like you're getting so close to, because one of the quickest ways to shorten the lifespan of a newly planted tree, or even an established tree, is to run into it accidentally with the deck of a lawnmower or hit it with a string trimmer. So creating that mulch barrier, traps the moisture, reduces competition, but keeps some of those potentially damaging things away. Also, over time, it adds organic matter, especially if you're using hardwood mulch. Breaks down fairly quickly. You might have to replace it every year at least. In urban settings where maybe it's fairly poor soils, you pick the right species for those soils, but adding that mulch every year as it gets broken down can improve the health of that soil around the base of that tree. Different types exist. Wood chips, typically they're the cheapest. They're the larger chunks, kind of more natural looking. That's usually what I use, especially on my property. You can get shredded hardwood. That's kind of nice because of how finely it's shredded, it kind of forms more of a thatch. I've used this before, and one of the issues I ran into is sometimes that thatch is so dense that you can be trying to water the tree and water over the root system, and it's just running right off of that mulch. So if you do use that and you notice that becoming an issue, maybe once a year or twice a year, just come in there with your hands and kind of break it up, loosen it up, make sure that water still percolates down through fairly easy. And then pine bark, which I think is usually also a little bit cheaper than shredded hardwood. So one thing I see all the time, especially when I'm at grocery stores or shopping centers, and they've got all those little trees and those islands in the parking lot, we want to avoid mulch volcanoes. Sorry, combining words here. And that's when you'll see folks that pile the mulch up about 2 feet high or over a foot high, and they push it right up against the bark of the tree. It might look fairly pretty. It really looks like someone mulched that tree. But again, for the same reason, we don't want to bury that root collar underground. We don't want to bury it in mulch, right? That's trapping moisture against the bark, only increasing the opportunities for fungus and other things to grow or for that bark to rot. So what we go for is the donut. And we have this handy rule of thumb, 3 by 3 by 3. So roughly a 3-foot diameter circle around the tree that's about 3 inches thick. And we leave 3 inches of space around the base of that tree, no matter what the diameter is, leaving about 3 inches of space, kind of pull the mulch back so it's not resting against the base of that tree. Now, as far as watering, obviously, as soon as possible after planting, you'd like to get some water on there. The trees are going to go through a bit of shock, right? They're being planted into conditions that they haven't been grown in for most of their life. Potentially different conditions. Maybe they're now in an open field, whereas before at a nursery, they were under some shade cloth. So it's really important during the first 3 years or so, that establishment phase, that they're being watered regularly. That's why we plant during the times of year that we do, right? We're hoping for ample rain during the first few weeks or months after being planted. But even after that, for the first 3 years, keep an eye on them, checking once a week. I don't actually go out and, dig down in the soil 6 inches and see if it's damp. I'll typically, if you have a rain gauge in your yard or nearby the planting, that's really useful. But I'll kind of keep track of the weather, and if it's been maybe a week or we haven't gotten much rain this week, ideally, if they can get an inch of rain per week, that should suffice, again, depending on the size of the tree that you're planting. Otherwise, the rule of thumb is about 1.5 gallons roughly of water per inch diameter of that tree. Now, this varies by species. Some species, we'll say they've got wetter feet, right? They're more adapted to wet conditions, others drier. But that's kind of a rough rule of thumb. But always, you do some research on the species you're planting and just kind of verify that. But we want to make sure that we're getting them plenty of water, helping them grow until their root system is established. It's much wider and it's found a lot more of that moisture within the soil. And we'll be watering within the drip line, right? So, within the root area that exists, and then as the years go by, the drip line would be kind of the extent that the canopy has grown out to. So starting from the edges of the canopy in toward the trunk, that's what we would consider the drip line. That's where you want to apply the water if you are doing any watering. There's no sense in coming out here and watering this grass when we know that the root system of the tree is contained within this mulch here. All right, so we've got our mulch in, we've done our watering, we're ready to protect our trees, and this isn't necessary in every setting. I mean, you'll know best typically if it's your property, if you do have a lot of deer pressure. In my yard, I have none, so I'm lucky that I don't always have to worry about that. But even other animals like rabbits, I've lost 2 red oak seedlings that they were very small. They were only about 18 inches tall and probably not even as big around as my pinky. And over one night, they were both snipped right in half by rabbits, because I've got a lot of rabbits in my yard. So they do make shorter plastic tubes compared to what you see in the back here. That might be useful if you're worried about rabbits and you don't have deer pressure. But if you do have deer, you can either use tubes like you see in the background here, and we'll see on the next slide. Those are for smaller seedlings that don't have such a broad canopy. But as you can see in these images, right, these are larger trees, probably 10-gallon, maybe 7, but probably 10-gallon containerized seedlings. They've got a fairly well-established canopy that's too wide to be shoved in one of those little tubes. There's a couple different methods people use. So this is deer fencing. It's like a plastic, fairly flexible and pretty inexpensive material. This is pretty handy. It's really easy to reuse. It's easy to transport. It's not going to rust. And it's flexible. And then they've used 2 wooden stakes. Now, I probably would recommend for a tree with a canopy of this size, since you can already see it's poking through a little bit, maybe taking that a little bit wider. So I don't really pre-cut my cages. If we're using something like this, I'll do it on site once the trees are planted, because some you can go a little bit narrower, some you might need to make wider. And 3 stakes will help, keep it more keep it wider instead of this might elongate it and cause the size to collapse a little bit more. You can also use metal cages. I don't have a picture here, but you can imagine it's very similar. I do, personally, I exercise a little bit of caution using metal cages only because if there's chances you've got grounds crew that could be running into those metal cages. I've seen them get dislodged before since they're a solid structure. And when they get dislodged, they'll break off or, dig into the main stem or break off branches of the tree that you're trying to protect. So I kind of like these plastic ones because that's not going to happen if they get run into by a mower deck. The downside is deer can push these in to reach the ends of the limbs when they're browsing. So, kind of weigh your options and maybe try different things out. But any protection is better than none if you're going to have high deer pressure. And this is just another image of some of those tubes we use. This is kind of a typical afforestation planting for us. We use tiny little tubelings like you saw in one of those earlier root collar images. We're planting really dense 300 trees per acre to establish a new forest. So these tubes are perfect. The trees, they kind of create a little bit of a mini greenhouse effect by maintaining moisture at the bottom of the tube. They also protect these young seedlings from being in direct sunlight and getting sun scorch pretty well. So it extends the growing season a little bit, protects from deer browse and buck rub. So we'll leave them on usually until the tree's starting to get close to, filling out the diameter of that tube. And then sometimes we'll cut them and leave them on so that they can expand, but they still protect against buck rub. But we might also just cut them and remove them entirely. All right, so let's talk about, the pruning of our trees, when to prune, tools to use. So this is an image from that tree owner's manual. We've got a couple different hand tools, and you can definitely use, gas-powered electric chainsaws or pole saws. I just I'd recommend, again, exercising caution. And if you slip up with one of these hand saws, you might make a small cut in an unintended part of the tree that it could grow over fairly easily. With a chainsaw, it's pretty immediate, and the collateral damage can be a bit much. So I like to stick to just using, hand tools like these. Hand pruners are nice for freshly planted trees or small branches, loppers for a little bit larger. And then anything larger than what those two can handle, utilizing hand saws, whether they be on the end of a pole or just, one that is fairly short. This is one of the favorite tools of mine when I'm pruning my own trees. So for the first 3 years or so, you're only going to want to look at pruning critical branches or critical areas. So that's going to be broken limbs, which you might have to do right when you get it from the nursery, dead limbs, and then selective pruning to try to pick one, dominant leader. And so you can see here in this image on the right, we've got 2 leaders that are going to be competing. It's really important to prune these early on, because if you allow these 2 to continue to grow, sometimes they don't have the greatest branch union, which we're going to see in another slide. And a couple of years down the road, this could be a weak point and break off, actually. So I have a neighbor or someone who lives near me who, after I think it was 2 storms ago, we've had quite a few up here in Carroll, and it wasn't during the storm, it was the day after. It was a Norway maple that had, 3, probably 8 feet off the ground. It broke into kind of 3 co-dominant leaders, and 2 of them just sheared off. They didn't appear, driving by, to be damaged, but they had weak unions, and over the years, rot was actually occurring within them, but you couldn't tell. So if you can pick one that's the straightest, prune the other, you'll have one dominant leader, and you're eliminating, something that even maybe just a few decades down the road could cause an issue. Here's an example of a freshly planted tree, or not planted, but going to be, that we got from a nursery. It lost its primary leader sometime during its lifespan at the nursery. And so we're going to go ahead and selectively prune for a new one. In this case, you might remove both of these. This top one here kind of has the best, growth form, especially compared to the existing main stem. So we're going to remove at least this one on the right, maybe both of them, depending on how much more canopy is below that, so that becomes the new dominant leader, which is going to control the overall growth form of that tree. And I did this in my own backyard with a yellow poplar that had two pretty much identical codominant leaders. I climbed up on a ladder here and took one of them off so that I've eliminated this being an issue later on down the road. It's always much easier to do pruning like this early in the life of a tree, so that you're not having to do it later on when it's a bigger ordeal and it's a lot more expensive and a bit more hazardous. So you're also going to look for, when you are pruning, you're looking for kind of safety concerns, again, thinking down the road, right? And I mentioned the branch unions, weak versus strong. So really acute angles on branches, whether it be from the main stem or, breaking off of the main stem, those are typically going to be our weaker unions. And especially when you take a look at not just the angle that those are growing at, but the bark between them. So if you see a nice ridge, kind of a clean ridge running between them, that means there's a strong union, the grain of the wood's growing together between those two branches. And again, also not as acute of an angle. The one on the right, maybe they're kind of pushing up, they're not pushing up. There could still be a bulge, but then you'll notice almost like a little valley in between them. We call that included bark, meaning there's actual, exterior bark within that union. It's not fully growing together. It could actually be pushing against each other, again, weakening that union, especially over the years. And then again, looking for, broken limbs, dead limbs, maybe infected limbs. If you notice fungi growing on some limbs, out at the exterior, try to prune it off closer to the tree. You're trying to remove any potential diseased branches or branches that as they fall off could damage healthy branches. When you prune, you're going to want to use, if it's not small enough to use loppers or hand pruners on, use the 3-cut method, which I'll show in another image here shortly. But that 3-cut method is going to be, a few inches away from where you would do your final cut, just outside of the branch collar here. A couple inches away, you're going to do your initial undercut, meaning you're cutting from the bottom of the branch upward. Roughly going 1/3 of the way through the branch, but the farther into that branch you go, that weight on the edge, you could pinch your saw and now it's stuck there. So just kind of be cautious. If you notice it's starting to get tough, maybe remove it so you don't get your saw pinched. But you're trying to make a cut under that so that when you come and make your second cut, which is going to be out away from the main stem, you're going down vertically all the way through. And this is to avoid any accidental damage by the stripping of bark, which I'll talk about on the next slide. Once you do your second cut, you'll be left with this here, right? So we did our first cut, our second cut. And the reason this first cut exists, if this was a longer, heavier branch, I might be halfway through this second cut, or if I didn't do my first cut, this is my only cut, it might snap off before I'm ready for it to, and peel bark. I've seen it peel bark all the way down the stem you're looking to remove, the branch you're looking to remove, and come down the main trunk of the tree, leaving this long wound. That's not going to be very easy for that tree to heal over, again, opening that tree up to potential pathogens or fungus growth. So in this image, we've done our first cut, our undercut, our second cut to remove a bulk of that limb, and then our third cut, as you can see here. So this third cut occurred outside of, let me see if I can go back, this branch collar. So it's pretty easy to see in this real world setting. Here's where that ridge existed. It was a strong union. This is just a low growing limb. It was going to be interfering with me as I mow my lawn, or folks maybe want to sit on this bench. So you want to cut just outside of that branch collar, where that ridge exists, because within this region, there are what we call meristems. And these are cells that can be differentiated to become different types of cells within a tree. And there's a bunch of them within this region that are going to easily, or I'd say more easily, grow new bark that's going to form over top of this new wound that you've created. So I meant to get an image of this already, within one season of pruning this, this yellow poplar is getting close to closing over top of this wound I created because I did the cut appropriately. Sometimes you'll see folks come in and do a flush cut. they remove that branch collar altogether, and those wounds may never heal over appropriately. So we also don't want to leave any stubs. Like if you cut this here and you left this branch, those meristems don't exist in the capacity that can grow and heal over the end of this branch. So this would just die. It'll dry out. You might see this in a natural setting. It's not a big deal, right? In a forested setting or an afforestation planting, we're looking for a natural forest ecosystem. We're not so concerned with this. In a backyard or an urban setting where we want our trees to be strong and healthy, if this were to rot, it could actually rot down into kind of the main stem of the tree here, creating a cavity, which again, in a natural setting, that'd be great. But we don't want any weak spots in our urban trees. So you might be asking, when should I do all of this pruning? So the dormant season is typically the best for most of our species. It's also the easiest on us. You can actually see where the branches are. You don't have leaves in your way. You can trace where each branch goes to. So dormant season, when trees aren't, haven't broken bud and leafed out, that's the best time. Some of our species, like red buds, if you do prune in the dormant season, you might actually be eliminating some branches that would be flowering that year. So you could wait till maybe early summer, wait till that bloom occurs, you get that nice pop of those pinkish red flowers, and then you can handle your pruning after that. Again, typically the first 3 to 10 years, maybe every 1 to 2 years, you're going to prune, 1 to 3 after that. During the first 3 years, I know we had a question about this, really try to stick to just the critical areas, the critical branches, those dead, broken, or selective pruning for leaders and overall growth form. This is a perfect time to mention, we never want to remove more than about 30% of live branches in one of these pruning sessions. Again, same thing with the concept of doing that inspection at the beginning. We want to leave enough of the food factory of the tree, right? That's our leaves, intact so that it can produce enough sugars to put on new wood to heal over those pruning wounds. You don't want to come in and completely, defoliate a tree basically by pruning. It might have enough energy to grow new buds, new branches, but that's critical resources that it might need to save up for more difficult years. Yeah, and then I think that pretty much covers that one. That's it. That's the last slide. So I know we had some questions that were submitted prior to registration. So Lauren, if it's right with you, I might stop sharing and then kind of flip over to that document on my end.
Yep, that sounds good.
And I'll just start addressing them.
Questions that come in during the talk as well that I have added to your list in green, just so you're aware.
Thank you so much. All right. So let's see, I'm gonna try to decipher through these and get to the ones that I maybe didn't answer during my presentation. So I know someone asked when they registered about pruning or trimming up fruit trees to maintain their fruiting vitality. And so I'm not an expert in, a lot of the fruiting trees or doing it in an orchard setting, but I definitely know that, pruning during that dormant season is going to invigorate the remaining buds to grow even better, maybe producing even more fruit. And I know that I've read that keeping a little bit more of an open canopy, right, a little bit more space within the branching is helpful for pollination as well. So I would definitely recommend doing some pruning, but maybe doing research on a specific species, whether it's peach, pear, plum, to really maximize the fruit production. That's just not something I've got a ton of experience in. Another really good question: how do you know when a tree is in distress, and what are the steps to help it? This is a great question, and it's something that everyone should kind of keep in mind. So, one of the obvious things you're going to notice, one of the most noticeable things, is when trees don't leaf out in the spring, right? And a lot of you are probably noticing this with some of our oak species that might be succumbing to fungal pathogens or sudden oak death, depending on where you are within the watershed. That's obviously one of the most blatant signs that something's wrong with your tree. It didn't leaf out at all. Sometimes it can be more subtle. It could be wilting of leaves. This could be due to heat stress. It could also be yellowing of leaves, right? Which could be from a myriad of reasons. It could be nutrient imbalance. It could be from excess lead in the soil. I know this is an issue some of our urban trees face. But my overall recommendation is that when you notice something just out of the ordinary, you've got a lot of limbs that are dying, not leafing out, wilting of leaves, yellowing of leaves. The tree just doesn't look as vital and healthy as it normally does from year to year. The best thing you can do is contact a certified arborist. They can come out, they can perform a myriad of tests to try to get to the root of the problem, what's causing the problem, and therein will lie the steps to potentially address it. It could be a lost cause depending on what what the issue is. But the best way to find a solution is to figure out what the problem is. So I recommend contacting a local arborist. I had someone ask about pruning street trees, and I did want to mention, so I know at least in the state of Maryland, you're required to get permits for those through Maryland DNR Forest Service. And I believe the work has to be done by a certified arborist. So you have to get a permit through DNR Forest Service, and a certified arborist has to do the work. So even if it's a right of way on your property, but it's technically a street tree, just check with those local ordinances, no matter where you are, to make sure you are actually allowed to, as the landowner, go out there and tend to those trees without any sort of authorization. Let's see. Oh, I had someone ask about, recommending fruit-bearing trees that grow well in Central Maryland. I can at least speak for a lot of the native species that you could find out in our native forest that we also use in a lot of our plantings. Pawpaws being one of them, American persimmon, American plum, black cherry, elderberry shrubs. There's quite a few. And that's one of those great things about that Chesapeake Bay native plant center that we set up with U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service is you can even put in there as a selective category is producing fruit, and it'll provide you a nice list of those. You want to? Oh, here, I'm gonna scroll down some of the new questions. All right, so how can we recognize that the roots have been circling in a small container too long to salvage a tree? Well, so basically what I recommend is no matter what, when you take that tree out of the container, even if they're really fine roots, start with your hands, right? Start to kind of break that root ball up, no matter how big or small. If it comes apart with your hands, pretty easy. What I usually like to do is kind of do a bit of a raking motion. I'm not sure if anybody here does bonsai. I've done research into it because I want to get into it, but I don't know that I have the patience or the free time. So it's a similar concept. You're raking the roots out. You're trying to allow them to grow out laterally naturally. A lot of times the smaller container I see limbs like what we use and some of our afforestation plantings. It's not that big of an issue. You can quickly kind of break that root mass up and then put it in the ground. What your main concern is going to be is those large roots, which again, don't be scared to get in there and really go to town, breaking them up and loosening that root mass up. The tree will grow new roots because of that. All right, so when planting, why do we need to use the same soil rather than amended? This is a good question. It's actually typically a part of the presentation, but I figured I'd try to make sure I didn't take too much time. I wanted to leave time for questions. I'm glad you brought that up. I guess I would recommend, the only time I'd recommend amending soil would be if you're in a really urban environment. And I've been in situations where you start digging the holes and there's trash, there's construction debris, rubble, things like that. Then I'd recommend maybe bringing in some topsoil or something, because there's actually no soil in there. We usually don't recommend amending soil to plantings because it's something that's temporary and would need to be done time and time again. We rather would encourage folks to do some research and find a native tree species that's well adapted to those conditions. Like some of our species, hackberries, river birch, and others, some are going to do better in poorer soils, meaning either compacted, urban influence, or a little bit more nutrient poor. Like picking the right tree for the right site in the long run is going to be more cost effective than trying to amend the soil by adding fertilizer, things like that. We're also planting the trees here at the Alliance to reduce nutrient pollution. So adding excess nutrients to the soil is something we want to avoid as well. But by all means, if you've got to actually put soil in the hole because it's full of garbage and debris, then you don't have a choice there. Okay, so someone asked me to explain that the mulching rule again. So let me flip back. Oh, I guess I can't as easily. So 3 feet in diameter, right? So 3 foot wide ring around the tree, and that's just a loose rule. Like the more the merrier, honestly. The more space you've got protected around the tree and competition you reduce, the better. And also something that you might think about if you've got poison ivy or something else that's growing you don't want there, you could put cardboard down and then add mulch on top of that, maybe use a weed mat. But we go for about 3 feet wide around the tree, roughly 3 inches thick, meaning we don't want a really thin layer of mulch that turf grass or other weeds are just going to start popping up through. We, just for cost effective reasons, you don't want to go super, super thick, but roughly 3 inches thick as far as the layer. And then about a 3-inch space between where the interior ring of mulch is compared to the stem of the tree. So that's where the donut kind of comes in. So 3 feet wide and then kind of 3 inches spacing from the base of the tree to the edge of the mulch on the interior. And again, that's just a loose rule. It doesn't have to match those measurements, but 333 is pretty easy to remember. Yeah, so does properly pruning lower branches from a tree redirect more of the tree's energy to growing taller? Yes, it does. It's gonna allow that tree to expend its resources into vertical growth. Sometimes you will get kind of excess lateral growth from nearby branches, but overall that's the goal. If you prune those lateral branches, it can put more energy into elongation. The yellow poplar that I pruned actually, I pruned a couple limbs that were really low, and within the next season, dormant buds they're latent buds, they were just underneath those branches, actually started to grow. So I pruned those off as well. And it's growing even faster vertically. I mean, they grow really fast anyway. It's a good starter tree. I know that was another question. I guess I'll touch on real quick. I don't know if I could recommend any trees as like starters, but I would recommend trees that grow relatively fast in a wide range of conditions, which would any of our maples, right, are particularly red and silver maple. Yellow poplars, fairly low maintenance, grows really quick. Sycamore grows really well everywhere. River birch I've seen grow in a myriad of conditions. Okay, so then kind of already touched on that other putting manure around trees beneficial. I would say again, just trying to avoid excess nutrients. I would steer clear of that and just pick a tree that would do well in the soil type that exists on your property. Is rainwater from asphalt shingles okay for trees? I haven't actually had a lot of experience trying that. I can't see it being, I could see it being sensitive, some of our trees being sensitive, or maybe if it's a fruit tree, considering what, chemicals could be in that or leaching out of the asphalt shingles, I'd say maybe be careful if it's something you're going to be feeding upon. But most of our native hardwoods, I don't really see that posing much of an issue. If you started to notice maybe yellowing of the leaves, something like that, I'd say stop. But if sounds like maybe you're capturing rainwater from your roof and it's going into a rain barrel, I say have at it. It's nice to recycle that water. All right, I think there might be a few more in here, Lauren, that I didn't get to. I did have someone ask, and I think it's maybe a great time to kind of touch on this of, how trees kind of factor into the nutrient reduction goals for the Chesapeake Bay watershed. So they provide that, especially in our afforestation settings. What we're really trying to do is transform and restore the ecosystem on the land, especially using streamside buffers, what we call riparian buffers. So as the trees establish, they're doing, it's kind of a multitude of benefits. And the older that these buffers get, the greater those benefits are. So obviously as they grow, they're taking up nutrients and they're taking up water that's in that soil. So we've got less, runoff that occurs. And this really, really starts to take place the older those buffers get, they start to go 10, 15 years old and older, they're dropping, leaf litter every single year. Some limbs are falling, some trees are shaded out, they die. We're kind of creating and altering actually the composition of that land cover, not just the trees themselves, but the land cover between those trees. If you've ever walked in a forest, especially if you step off trail, you'll notice that the ground's a lot softer. There's that duff layer that forms over the years. So what we're looking for over time, that starts to occur within these riparian forest buffers, right? They also, between the canopy and that duff layer, they start to slow down rainfall during heavy rainstorms, which again is reducing that risk of sheet flow. And then sheet flow that occurs, meaning, I guess I'll touch on sheet flow. When we get excess rain that occurs on turf grass, pasture, cornfields, and obviously impervious surfaces like asphalt, there's only so much water that can infiltrate down into the soil with those types of land use before that it's oversaturated and it begins to run off the surface. That's when we get a lot of our erosion. We get a lot of the nutrients being carried in that process. Well, if we've got a forest buffer between that runoff and that body of water that's establishing, again, that kind of rougher surface, right? We've got that duff layer, a lot of leaf litter, multiple stems growing. It can slow that sheet flow down. And then as the roots are breaking up the soil, creating little kind of micro passages, that duff layer also, creating a bit of a spongy top layer. There's a lot more water that can be absorbed and infiltrate into that soil in a shorter period of time than any of those other land use types. If anybody is interested, I don't know if I shared my emails. It was just briefly at the end of the screen. I've got a couple scientific articles that are really, really good at demonstrating that, some studies that were done comparing exactly that, how much water can infiltrate into the soil in a forested setting, a newly planted forested setting, turf grass, row crops, etc. So long and short, that's what a lot of our rural plantings are doing in urban environments. They're terrific at also, again, slowing down that rainfall before it reaches the impervious surface. They're also great for, reducing that urban heat island effect that people feel living in urban environments. And obviously all around, we're increasing wildlife and biodiversity. So multitude of benefits that just, not just the nutrient pollution reduction.
Thanks, Zach. Yeah, if you want to share your contact information or your email in the chat, it'd be really helpful. But this was incredible. I just want to thank you so much for sharing such an informative talk with us. At the Alliance, our mission is to bring together communities, companies, and conservationists to improve our lands and waters in the Chesapeake Bay watershed. And I, for one, certainly feel like I, at least at home, can take some small step in having an impact where I live. So this was much appreciated. Following this call, you will all receive an email from me with a link to watch the recording. And if you have any questions, you can feel free to respond to that email. And I can, of course, field any questions over to Zach, or you can feel free to send them to him directly. But for myself, on behalf of the Alliance for the Chesapeake Bay, thank you all so much for being here and asking the Alliance today.
Yeah, thanks, everybody.